BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
When I say the words, the elements, what comes to mind? Perhaps it's the ideas that came out of ancient Greece. Our world seen through earth, air, fire, and water. Or are you thinking chemistry and atoms and the 118 elements in the periodic table, ranging from naturally occurring hydrogen to synthesized Einsteinium? And yes, there is such a thing. Or has climate and weather come to mind, the elements we face in nature? Well, a few weeks ago, the meaning of the elements was put to some of the world's leading food scholars who'd gathered at St Catherine's College for the annual Oxford Food Symposium, an event founded more than 40 years ago.
All cheese classics, from Roquefort to Camembert.
Hundreds of people attend to present papers, hear presentations, discuss ideas, and share meals. This programme is a collection of some of the stories from this year's symposium. Think of this as one of our special mixtape editions. We have one theme, the elements, but it will be explored in a mind-boggling diversity of ways, all of which, I believe, are captivating. For example, out of fire comes ash, which turns out to be an ingredient that shaped food around the world.
Typically people say oils and water never mix, but in Nigeria, when you add a little bit of ash water, you transform oil and water into this creamy, saucy dressing, and it's just fascinating.
On the subject of chemistry, we'll hear why the Trump administration, and RFK Jr. in particular, have come to sound like radical food activists.
What they're saying needs to be done is to restrict ultra-processed foods, to get the chemicals out of the food supply, and the particular chemicals that they're concerned about are color additives.
Surrounded by the element of water, we'll hear how in the 19th century the British Navy laid the foundations for the modern food industry.
I think there is a legacy that touches all of us. I mean, for good or bad, the systematization of food production and quality control that the Royal Navy undertook, especially at its big outports, was unique. Not just to the British Isles, but yes, everywhere.
And we'll hear reflections on perhaps the most mysterious and invisible of ingredients, air, and the chefs who have celebrated it.
He started to use a machine called siphon. And this was to do these crazy ideas from foams or carrot air.
Really? Carrot air?
It was like a fantasy. It was not food, really.
Let's begin with a talk at the symposium which explored the relationship between the periodic table, food, and our brains. Which elements do we need, and which ones should we be avoiding?
Most of the brain is hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen and carbon. So you could argue it's mostly air, or rather 80% water. And then that's needed for just having a brain.
This is Anders Sandberg, who's worked as a neuroscientist at the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford.
But then you need other elements to do the work. So you get the various electrolytes that are actually allowing the electrical signals to move on. And then you get to the various compounds in organic chemistry that do a lot of the hard work, the enzymes. And many of them use sulfur and phosphorus. And then they also quite often require various metals in small amounts. The iron, the copper, the zinc. Essential for brain function, but not necessarily that you get smarter by having too much of them. And then you get to the micronutrients, and the really rare ones.
Which could include molybdenum, found in legumes, chromium, of which broccoli is a source, and iodine, which is abundant in seaweed. What we don't want from the periodic table are radioactive elements, and heavy metals such as lead, once used to store and mature wine. What made it possible to understand the role of certain elements in the workings of our neurons and neural pathways, our axons, was pioneering research in the 1930s, explained at the symposium by Anders' co-author and presenter, physicist Len Fisher.
The way that it works was discovered by two Cambridge physiologists called Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley, working in the Plymouth Marine Laboratory. The reason why they were working down there was because they could get squid, and squid have a particularly long axon, the long projection from a nerve cell, a neuron, which is big, about 1 millimeter diameter. It can be up to 1 meter in length. And so you can work on it, you can stick electrodes in it, you can measure voltages, you can apply voltages. In this way, they worked out that the electrical signals involve sodium and potassium being shoved out through channels gradually and sequentially along the nerve, along the axon. Now, we get our potassium from fruits like banana, avocado, or from leafy vegetables like spinach, and we get our sodium in the form of sodium chloride.
Table salt. And the key point Anders and Len were making at the symposium is that our bodies are beautifully adapted to keep the perfect balance for our brains as long as we have a diverse, healthy diet of whole food. Supplements and food products marketed for the brain aren't really necessary. In fact, quite the opposite.
If you can eat a varied diet, then it's fairly easy to get the micronutrients you need. And there is a real risk of overdosing. Some of these elements are toxic at too high doses. Selenium is kind of a beautiful example because it's essential. You really need it. But if you get too much, then you actually get sick from it. And the most common way people get selenium overdoses these days is actually eating supplements.
And Brazil nuts?
They're definitely worth mentioning because they're fantastic, lovely nuts, but they're also so rich in selenium that actually you probably shouldn't be eating more than 4 or 6 per day. Otherwise, you might get too much selenium. Oh. But at the same time, the natives in the areas where they grow eat a lot more of them. And they don't seem to get selenium poison. So there might be more to figure out here how to handle them.
Anders Sandberg with Len Fisher on chemical elements, food and our brains. Let's turn to a key element of a food culture. In his talk, food historian Nader Mehravari, who's originally from Iran, made the case that in Persian cuisine you'll not only find a wider range of sour ingredients than in any other food culture, but also the most sour ingredient ever tasted.
The one that I shared with the audience in the symposium is called qaraqurut. It is a souring agent that takes a good couple of days to prepare because you have to first make a yogurt that's very sour, so the fermentation period could be 48 hours. You then churn the yogurt the old-fashioned way to separate the butter from it, and what's left is the old-fashioned buttermilk. That buttermilk is then cooked. The cooking process causes the liquid to solidify. It's drained. The solids are separated. The liquid is boiled down twice after having been drained again. And then the last time it's boiled down for an extended period of time, 3, 4, 5 hours at very low temperatures. And you end up with a dark, black, sticky substance called qaraqurut that some people claim is one of the most sour elements anywhere. Some people like it as a snack, just a small bite of it.
Some brave people.
Yes, some brave people. And if you eat, by the way, if you have too much of it on your mouth, your tongue will start cracking. It's that sour. And then, since it's very powerful, a small amount of it adds a very nice sour tone into soups and stews. And since it was very strong, you could carry a small piece of it when you had the opportunity to cook a dish.
Nader Mehravari. Just listening to that story makes me want to pucker my lips. At more than 40 years old, the symposium is a unique institution, and I'd argue one that's absolutely necessary. And here I admit to being biased. Founded around the same time the food programme first took to the airwaves, it shares a similar purpose in wanting food to be treated as a serious subject, worthy of intellectual examination as well as journalistic investigation. Leading that call originally was one of the symposium's founders, a legendary writer, publisher and food historian, Alan Davidson, who, it can be argued, shaped the way food history is studied, written about and discussed today. Here he is being interviewed on Radio 4 in 1993.
Alan Davidson, as a writer and a food historian, you're also the co-founder of the Oxford Food Symposium.
That's right, yes. In 1981 was the first full-scale one.
I'm not sure if I've got it right, but is it a lot of intellectuals talking about food at Oxford?
There are quite a lot of intellectuals, but it's not just intellectuals. It's a real mixture of people, and we've always made a great point of having people who have no special qualifications, not academic, not professional food writers, nothing like that, just interested in food.
Are you more interested yourself in eating ordinary plain food than exotic stuff? Or are you more interested in writing about it than eating it?
I'm interested in exotic food, if by exotic you mean unusual. Yes, definitely. I'm not interested in expensive or over-elaborate dishes.
I mean, what's your idea of a really nice meal to sit down to?
Well, I must say I'm very partial to fish and chips.
Alan Davidson. One of the early attendees at the symposium was the writer and illustrator Elizabeth Luard.
I think that the Oxford Symposium is basically built on the fact that we were all amateurs at that point, because we were none of us professionals in that. You know, we weren't chefs or anything like that, just people who were really interested in food. Well, we had Jane Grigson, who obviously was a food writer. We had scientists, we had philosophers. It's not actually really a gathering of food people. It's a gathering of people who are interested in food. So I think the fact that you can find people who can contribute other things, that was really important. The first thing was just a group of people, which was Theodore Zeldin, who was he's a philosopher, French. It was Paul Levy. It was, as I say, Jane Grigson, Elizabeth David, so there were food writers in there. And I suppose the gathering was based on the fact that food writing wasn't respectable. Historical food writing, at least, wasn't. But everybody in that group probably knew that it was important. It was really probably the most important thing in the world.
The current chair of the symposium is Kathy Kaufman.
I am a culinary historian and now an adjunct professor in food studies. I have been coming to the symposium every year since 1998.
And why did it take so long for food to be treated as a serious subject by the likes of universities and academic institutions?
The problem was the almost mundane quality of food. We see it every day, unless you are impoverished, that sort of thing. It's almost taken for granted, and it was certainly taken for granted in the academy because it wasn't great white men activities. It was something that, at least in the domestic context, was very female-oriented and wasn't taken that seriously. That changed with lots of the more interdisciplinary studies that came about in the 70s and 80s, and it finally percolated into food really in the 1990s.
Do you think the symposium has made a contribution to that shift?
It absolutely has made a contribution, because when you look at some of the initial folks who were coming to the symposium and founding it, somebody like an Alan Davidson, a Claudia Roden, people like that, Elizabeth Luard, just very thoughtful, smart people who were bringing a serious approach to food, but nonetheless not losing any of the joy that was associated with food. And I think that is in part what Oxford has done, certainly for me, realizing that you don't have to have this divergence between serious, respectful thought and pleasure and what it means to be human in the nicest possible sense.
Kathy Kaufman, let's return to the symposium and the elements. Our next story revolves around fire or at least the remnants of fire.
Hi, my name is Ozoz Soko. I am a food explorer and ex-exploration geologist. I also am an educator. I teach food and tourism studies in Ontario, Canada. For the elements, I looked at fire, and my friend and I, Danielle, who collaborated on a paper, focused on ashes, culinary ashes as salts.
Which is something I have not come across. So can you, where are we in terms of geography? Where are we in time? Explain.
Geography, we're all over the world. Initially, we were going to explore ashes in Nigerian cuisine. We're both Nigerian. But when we started researching, we found ashes used throughout history and on every continent, from 15th century Portuguese use of ashes in curing olives and peaches, to indigenous Americans using ashes in a variety of corn-based culinary creations. So we found ashes everywhere, used both as ashes themselves, but also soaked in water and the liquid decant used.
So the dominant story, obviously told, is one of flames, fire, heat, and the transformation of ingredients. What happens after is the key thing that's interesting. Yes. I had no idea.
And I think what's really, really interesting about this is how, historic peoples might have revered fire and so might have considered all parts of fire sacred, and they may have accidentally stumbled on ashes, because ashes typically, depending on what the root stock is, overall they have a basic or alkalizing quality. In addition to curing things in ashes, you can actually preserve things in ashes. So the Amish, for instance, would preserve fresh tomatoes over many months. So they would harvest the tomatoes, at the height of the growing season, and lay them on beds of ashes and cover them for many months. And the tomatoes stay fresh and without blemish.
How does it work?
So the ashes have antibacterial qualities that reduce the microbial load, prevent bugs and bacteria from, so kind of they inoculate things and create this protective environment. In Japan, ashes are used along with koji to make some kind of ferments. So you see, the ashes have so many different functions, from changing the chemistry of doughs. So regular corn transforms into masa, creates this elasticity. In Nigeria, we use ash water to enhance both the color of okra and jute leaves, but also the viscosity, right? It strengthens the viscosity. We also use it to emulsify water and oils. So, typically people say oils and water never mix, but in Nigeria, when you add a little bit of ash water, you transform oil and water into this creamy, saucy dressing that you can use in salads, to coat meats, and it's just fascinating.
So on the specific salt story, the plants that take up salt, you burn them, and then you have a source of salt.
So the halophytes, plants that can grow well in salty environments, but also sometimes have crystals of salt on their leaves. You have things like saltbush, different kinds of seaweed, and so those might have functioned as the kind of initial root stock for creating ashes.
Ozo Soku on a form of edible diversity I hadn't fully appreciated. How do you turn a symposium theme into a dining experience? Across 3 days of lunches and dinners, there are unique food experiences, each one created by a guest chef based on his or her interpretation of the theme. Symposium Chair Kathy Kaufman.
One of the things that we feel very strongly about is that the meals are truly part of our curriculum. They are every bit as important as the papers, keynote discussions, because they are there to illustrate aspects of whatever our annual theme is. So we very much want our chefs, who are very articulate, thoughtful people, to bring an interpretation through the plate that we can all enjoy.
My name's Cameron Stoke. I'm the Meals and Beverage Coordinator of the Oxford Food Symposium.
Which means what?
My role is to think about the theme of the year and then selecting the guest chefs, working with the guest chefs to tell the story about what that theme is.
The first meal was curated by Ana Ortiz, a chef who grew up on the volcanic Galapagos Islands, where the food culture is dominated by fire. And so there were sweet potatoes cooked on embers and pork over charcoal, all influenced by Anna's childhood, which was shaped by lava.
Thing that we will do is just go and stop in the most beautiful beach and just in the volcanic rocks just put some fire on, and actually a lobster cook on top of a volcanic rocks, and the only thing that we will have in there is just spices and onion puree and things, so we just put that on top of it. But super simple. That's the main thing with fire cooking. It's just the fire just gives this special flavor to every single ingredient.
And then I think the other fascinating thing is, and I think everyone will have an experience of this, of seeing fire, being hypnotized by the flames. Something happens in a social gathering of people around fire.
It's just something special. It's the sound of it, the cracking of the fire. People is just drawn to the theatrical look of the fires.
Bringing Anna's menu to life, as with all of the meals at the symposium, is the catering team of St Catherine's College, led by Tim Kelsey. For one weekend of the year, they switch from cooking for students to becoming one of the most extraordinary restaurants in the UK.
We've had people like Fergus Henderson, Jeremy Lee, Raymond Blanc, and we've had Turkish chefs, Chinese chefs who come in and wow us with their cuisine.
You've travelled the world through the symposium.
We have.
Travelled and tasted the world.
And the symposium has its own rituals. At the end of each meal, the team emerges from the kitchen, and led by the ringing of a bell, there's a standing ovation by the hundreds of symposiasts. From a fire-themed meal, let's turn to another of the elements, water. And for this story, we're heading out to sea in the 19th century with the Royal Navy.
The conventional wisdom describes a nightmare of putrid food, malnutrition, scurvy, and privation more generally. Jennifer Stead encapsulates...
In his presentation, culinary historian Blake Perkins set out to dispel myths of a naval life at sea in the Georgian era being filled with rotten scraps of food. Instead, Blake's research found that a sailor's diet was the stuff of envy.
People think it was miserable. The sailors were ridden with scurvy. They were whipped. They were flogged. Samuel Johnson said that being on a ship was like being in a jail, except it was safer in a jail and less unpleasant. But in fact, sailors, especially from the working class, less fortunate people, ate better than they could on land. Scurvy was much more prevalent during the winter, for example, in Britain, than it was on board Royal Navy ships during the period in question.
Which makes complete sense when you understand the scale of the challenge of crossing the oceans.
You've only got muscle and wind. There's nothing else to power anything. And these warships, these wooden worlds, were the most complicated engines of the time. They were crazy complicated machines. And you needed motivated people and fit people and people with good morale to operate them with any competence.
Which meant well-fed people.
Which meant well-fed people and happy people. So they would be given at least an hour and a half for the main meal of the day. And that was their time to do as they pleased.
And the time spent out at sea and the distances covered by the Navy depended on an ingenious food system.
Just for example, Nelson chasing the French back and forth across the Atlantic before Trafalgar. They'd been at sea for 22 months. And at the time of the battle, they had something like 100 or so cases of scurvy. The French and Spanish ships, and especially the Spanish ones, by contrast, would have hundreds of people stricken with the disease during the battle. So they really had figured out shipboard nutrition and hygiene to an extent nobody else had. And it made a big difference.
And at the heart of it all was an autonomous and powerful food organisation which oversaw a bespoke naval supply chain.
The Admiralty had a victualling board that was independent of the Admiralty. In fact, its offices were out in Tower Hill, far, far from Whitehall. And they were the ones who decided that the Navy was going to cure its own beef, bake its own biscuit, build its own barrels, things like that. So the quality control was paramount. And they standardized even the size of the hunks of meat. They standardized the diet. Everybody was allotted a certain amount of meat per day, per week, on a shifting basis throughout the week. But for example, and I should add that that's the preserved foods, but 40% or so of food that the Navy consumed at sea was fresh. They were constantly taking on stores of fresh food. And they had different problems in different places. The Baltic may have been the most challenging because the Baltic states, the Scandinavian countries, couldn't feed themselves. And when a Royal Navy squadron anchored off of a port in Scandinavia, other than the big cities, it could double the size of the town. And they were relying on imports anyway. So the Navy would invade islands, occupy them, and plant gardens and graze beef, and right in the middle of a war zone. So that's an example of the improvisation. They also provided for regulatory substitutes for flour. So much rice would be the equivalent of so much flour. Chickpeas sometimes in the Mediterranean when they're down toward the African coast, things like that.
And Blake argues that it was the innovations of the Admiralty's Victuals Board which laid the foundation for the food system we have today.
I think there is a legacy that touches all of us. I mean, for good or bad, it's really the industrialization and standardization of food production. The systematization of food production and quality control that the Royal Navy undertook, especially at its big outports, was unique. Not just to the British Isles, but yes, everywhere.
I'm not sure if we can blame the 19th century Admiralty for the prevalence of 21st century ultra-processed foods, but UPFs and their chemical elements were the focus for one of the symposium's keynote speakers, Marion Nestle, Professor of Nutrition, Food Studies and Public Health, and one of the most influential thinkers on the politics of food in the United States. What she hadn't expected to witness during her career was someone appointed by the White House who's as outspoken as she is on the industrial food system.
Oh, something is poisoning the American people.
This is RFK Jr., the United States Secretary of Health.
And we know that the primary culprits are changing food supply, the switch to highly chemical intensive processed foods. We have 10,000 ingredients in our country, in our foods. The Europeans have only 400. We need to fix our food supply, and that's the number one.
In the context of American politics, RFK Jr.'s attack on ultra-processed foods and the novel chemical elements in modern diets is unprecedented, argues Marion Nestle.
His comments about food are something that we've never heard in the United States from a person of that high position in government, except for Michelle Obama, who was worrying about children's obesity and let's end childhood obesity within a generation. And of course, the great irony is that the people who were most opposed to her and fought her in every possible way, saying that she was representing the nanny state, are now precisely the people who are talking about the poor health of American children and how important it is to do something about it. And what they're saying needs to be done is to restrict ultra-processed foods, to get the chemicals out of the food supply, and the particular chemicals that they're concerned about are color additives. Then these are the colors, the coal tar, petroleum dyes that public health advocates have tried to get out of the food supply for decades that are mainly used in candy, children's cereals, and frostings and things like that. There is quite a bit of evidence that these colors affect the behavior of some children, and there's some evidence that some of the colors are associated with cancer in experimental animals. And those suggestions, which have been very, very difficult to demonstrate conclusively, are enough to make public health advocates say, let's get rid of them. We don't need them. They're cosmetic. They're not necessary. They don't have any nutritional or safety function. Let's replace them with vegetable additives or vegetable colors like they have in the UK.
I'm curious about what else RFK represents when it comes to food, because we have heard him talking, for example, about raw milk, unpasteurized milk.
Yes.
We've heard him talking about ultra-processed food. We've heard him talking about the impact of the current agricultural food system in the US.
Well, as far as I can tell, what this is really about, and this is my speculation, is that this is about wellness products. What RFK Jr. loves is wellness products. He has just gone on record as saying that everybody should be eating Mom's Meals. Mom's Meals, which is a company that makes pre-prepared meals delivered to your home, highly ultra-processed, full of salt, and some of them are quite high in sugar. And he has said that he wants everybody wearing glucose monitors, even healthy people. He has announced being in favor of getting seed oils out of the food supply.
Just moving on to another theme that you touched on in your talk about UPFs, ultra-processed foods. What is your take on the use of UPF as a category of food?
Well, I'm greatly in favor of it. The evidence for an association of ultra-processed foods with poor health outcome is so overwhelming at this point that it cannot be ignored. And while that evidence is observational and can only prove association, not causation, there are two clinical trials to date that demonstrate that ultra-processed foods induce people to eat more calories. And there is a third clinical trial, as yet unpublished, that I happen to have seen, which is going to address a couple of the major criticisms of the concept of ultra-processed foods, and it comes out with a very similar result, that ultra-processed foods induce people to eat more calories, even under conditions when the foods are, quote, healthy, unquote. And we're talking here power bars, protein bars, yogurts, whole wheat breads, and so forth. They still induce people to eat more calories than do minimally processed food. The reasons why it has this effect are not really determined, but it seems to be a very high calorie density, lots of calories per weight of food, the texture of it, which makes it easier to eat quickly. You don't have to chew. And then the hyperpalatability that these foods are manufactured to be absolutely irresistible. You can't stop eating them. That's the whole point.
So on the question of what governments can do and are doing, you pointed to Latin America. Why?
Well, because several countries in Latin America are passing laws requiring warning labels on certain kinds of ultra-processed foods, not all of them. Certainly the ones that are high in fat, sugar, and salt, and high in calories for their weights. They're also, some of them, restricting the marketing of such foods to children. They have requirements about what foods can be sold in schools. These are major step forwards that can help people eat more healthfully.
And you mentioned the experience of walking into a Mexican supermarket.
I did. It's an astonishing experience because so many products have warning labels on them about their being high in saturated fat, sugar, or salt.
Marion Nessel, and in a statement, Mom's Meals told us their products are designed by professional chefs and registered dietitians who use evidence-based dietary guidelines, and that there is no universal definition of what constitutes ultra-processed food. For our next story, let's stay with intriguing ingredients, one that has no colour. It's invisible, the element air. and it featured in a presentation looking back at a 1990s culinary revolution, molecular gastronomy.
My name is Janet Acosta. I'm a professor at the Universidad Rey Juan Carlos in Madrid. My key idea was the air, because air is an invisible ingredient in the kitchen for our history. Remember soufflés, for example. The air is the key.
What interested Janet is the way in which chefs such as Spain's Ferran Adrià of El Bulli fame embraced new cooking techniques to blur the lines between cooking and art. And chief among these techniques, argues Janet, was the use of air.
The name of the cuisine changed to molecular cuisine, because air is science, it's not food really.
And in your presentation, you described an experience of eating at El Bulli and being served a foam called carrot air. Now, what was that like?
Yes! I was in El Bulli and it was incredible, believe me. It was like a fantasy. The flavor was really present, you know. You taste it, the flavor. But the air is nothing in your mouth, so there was no texture at all. So it was a kind of strange thing, you know. You just eat the bubbles of the juice.
And Janet, has this left you thinking differently about air?
You have to realize that this is an ingredient and you have to work with it.
Janet Acosta. Our last story brings together all of the different ways we've been thinking about the elements. It comes from West Africa, and it was told by Theodore Kabor, the World Food Programme head for Niger.
Big country at 1.2 million kilometers squares in West Africa, and with 26 million of inhabitants, with the highest population growth in the world. It's 3.9%.
Theodore's presentation explained how it's possible to bring the earth back to life by careful management of the elements, particularly soil and water. Decades of erosion can be reversed and agricultural land restored. This is happening in Africa through a project aimed at combating desertification called the Great Green Wall. Introducing his talk at the symposium was the former architect and food writer Carolyn Steele.
What I loved about Theodore's talk was that he really brought the big themes together of the elements. It could be nutrition, it could be molecules, obviously it's the weather, obviously it's climate change and so on. Really huge themes. And I mean, Theodore was amazing in the way and he actually said it in his talk, he actually brought, all of those themes together in the biggest possible way. This is the global picture.
We'll be talking about soils, lands, water, fire, air, meaning winds. I will be talking about all these elements.
As he said, earth, air, fire and water. Earth is the soil, air is the wind that causes soil erosion, fire is climate change, water is the thing we're trying to conserve. It's the absolutely vital element of all of these. In the Sahel, there's this great problem of desertification and, huge population growth, and people not able to feed themselves. And, the World Food Programme used to actually come and just give people, sacks of flour. And now they're actually helping them to rehabilitate the land through, astonishingly, these processes that turn out to be really traditional.
And I want to just give you an overview on these techniques. The first one is what we call half moon. It's basically half moon with 2 meters.
Half moons, which is digging a sort of, literally, as it says on the tin, a half moon shaped hole in the ground that sort of, arrests the water when the water comes, which is 3 months of the year, apparently. But these half moons help to retain the water and they create little sort of ecosystems. So they plant sorghum or millet or maize in them. And then that just provides enough of a tiny little world that it can sustain itself and stabilise the soil and actually increase organic matter over time.
So we have been combining land rehabilitation with gardening sites, particularly in places where the water table have been improved by these.
They've actually rehabilitated 300,000 hectares, since 2014. and planted 12 million trees, but these acres of, what used to just be desert are now just green and producing vast amounts of grain, and it's all done by the local communities.
Really help water extraction for them, and then they are trained for vegetable production. So they can now...
It's just literally turning desert back into a wonderfully productive agricultural landscape. So the implications of this are vast, and they're of global importance, because, of course, it means people can feed themselves, it gives them employment, it reduces their humanitarian needs, it reduces migration. They're not leaving there to go somewhere else. So I just can't think of anything more important or more inspiring, really.
Caroline Steele and Theodore Cabot on the Great Green Wall of Africa and bringing the elements back into balance. To find out more about the presentations at this year's Oxford Food Symposium, go to the Food Programme website. And if you have an ambition to become a future symposiast and even submit your own paper, here's a challenge from Kathy Kaufman.
Our theme for 2026 is poverty food, which is going to be, I think, a very important exploration both of poverty in the very, very obvious sense of folks who are in need, but it will also include things like the poverty of soil that is not creating foodstuffs that are sufficiently nourishing to us. Obviously, there will be historical questions about how different cultures have dealt with times of crisis, famine, and there will also be wonderful contrasts, I think, when you think about cucina povera, simple cuisines that have now become very, very popular. So we will have ways of bringing both joy, history, and a very serious thought about some of the major crises confronting the world through poverty food.